Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. At the beginning of the 21st century, there are so many spectacular environmental disasters in the world that nobody can deny the fact that the planet is really sick. The abandoned fishing boats in the middle of the desert that was once the Aral Sea in Central Asia, the multiple examples of massive deforestation in tropical countries, the smog produced by all our modern cities, the garbage that litters the countryside, the forest, or the most isolated beaches of the world, or the silting of many of our major river deltas, are all examples of very slow and well-documented pollution processes that our political leaders didn't stop. They behaved like the captain of the Titanic, who had been well informed about the presence of icebergs on the Atlantic Ocean the night his ship went to the bottom, and who nevertheless went to bed without ordering to slow down or to head south. Since our political leaders did almost nothing to stop even the slowest of the destruction processes I talked about, it is certain that they will react like the captain of the Titanic the day a brutal catastrophe will wake them up. Totally overwhelmed and disoriented by the sheer size of the disaster, they will do nothing useful. The main characteristic of any catastrophe is that it releases so much energy in a few minutes that the only thing humans can do to protect themselves is to run away. Normally, when a lot of energy is released very slowly in the environment, on a quiet river for example, humans can easily take advantage of it to move goods and peoples downstream. Things are totally different when the same river is blocked by an ice jam during the winter, because locals know that a catastrophe will happen. They know that the water pressure will build up behind the ice jam until it suddenly breaks and floods the surrounding area with mountains of ice. Because humans live on a pretty quiet planet, they believe that catastrophes are rare and exceptional events. They are wrong. It's the other way around. In fact, the universe we live in is a pretty dangerous place, full of cosmic rays that would kill us all if the Earth's magnetic field wasn't there to deflect them. There are also the billions of asteroids and comets that zip through our solar system and sometimes come crashing on the surface of the Earth. It happened in Tunguska, Russia in 1908. Under our feet also, the planet is a dangerous place, which is regularly shaken by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that often trigger very dangerous landslides, avalanches, fires, or tsunamis. If tsunamis, for example, are efficient killers, it is because they are not simple waves like those produced by the wind on the ocean. When you pass over a wave on the ocean, you always end up approximately where you were before, because it's not the water that moves laterally in a wave, but the energy it contains. The water only moves up and down with you, while the energy moves away. In a tsunami, it's different because it's the water itself that moves away. Normally, a tsunami is caused by a submarine earthquake, an earthquake that is produced at the limit of two of the gigantic tectonic plates the Earth's crust is made of. Since those plates move relative to one another, an enormous quantity of energy is sometimes accumulated at the limit of two of those plates until the rock buckles and pushes away an enormous quantity of water. This is what we call a tsunami. Coastal cities located in bays are very vulnerable when there is a tsunami, because the seafloor moves up and the coasts converge in such places, which force the water of the tsunami to pile up and form a wall of water that moves inland at high speed. What kills most people in a tsunami? It's not the water that moves in, but the water that comes back, because it carries an enormous quantity of debris that rip to bits all those who were unfortunate enough to be carried away by the tsunami. Since we live between the two very dangerous worlds we just described, why is it that it is so comfortable to live on the surface of the planet? It is because life surrounds and protects us. Forests, coral reef, bacteria, plants, and in fact everything alive consume so much energy to live and prosper that very little of it remains to create catastrophes on the surface of the earth. It is perfectly obvious when we cut the tropical forests because the cascades of pure water that used to fall through forested hills quickly become brown torrents of mud that clogs the surrounding lakes and rivers. If, according to a 2014 UN report, the number of natural catastrophes has increased fivefold since 1970, it is essentially because our industrial way of living kills life. As I explained in my book, most of our industries are not and have never been profitable. If the balance sheets of their owners say they are, it is because they don't take into account a lot of their costs, especially those related to the pollution they produce. Because the goal of our modern entrepreneurs is to maximize their year-end profits, everything they produce is made to be sold and not to be purchased. As a result, a lot of what comes out of their factories quickly end up in dumps. And they are quite happy with it. They call it planned obsolescence. They do that on purpose. Before the industrial era, most people didn't think that way. Things were made to last. This is the reason why so many 2,000 years old buildings are still in use today. There is at least one Roman aqueduct that is still working, as well as the main sewer of ancient Rome, the Cloaca Maxima. There is also the Gard Bridge in France, or, again in France, the Nimes Amphitheater. It is with the false profits they accumulated during the last 250 years by polluting and robbing people all over the world that our capitalists have financed the construction of a vast network of roads, railroads, and waterways that are used today to bring the natural resources of the world to small towns where they are transformed into finished products before being re-exported to port cities and finally to the world's richest countries and cities. That accumulation of wealth has become so important that according to Oxfam, less than 100 billionaires on the planet owns more than the poorest half of mankind. Such an imbalance is a clear indication that our civilization has reached certain physical limits. In fact, such a concentration of wealth and energy increases the chance that a major catastrophe will happen during the next decades. It is all the more probable because many of the complex and fragile systems our societies need to keep going have been built in dangerous places. For instance, many of our largest cities have been built near the oceans, which make them vulnerable to tsunamis or cyclones. Just remember that New Orleans has been heavily damaged by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. These cities are also at risk of being submerged if the ocean level was to rise due to the global warming predicted by our climatologists. Important cities like Tokyo, Istanbul, or San Francisco have been built near active geologic faults like the San Andreas Fault in California. There is also the fact that our global communication system has become heavily dependent on a fleet of satellites that could be destroyed at any moment by the chain reaction caused by the billions of debris produced by random collisions of satellites. As you can see on this image, such a collision occurred over the North Pole in 2014. There are also more than 400 active nuclear reactors on the planet, some of which are as old and as poorly designed as the Chernobyl or Fukushima reactors that exploded. We could also talk about the time bombs created by those who dumped radioactive waste in the ocean during the last decades. At a smaller scale, many roads have been built along cliffs in the mountains, despite the fact that it could provoke avalanches or landslides. Gigantic and extremely vulnerable skyscrapers have been built in many countries. Just remember the 9/11 attack of the World Trade Center. These days, we even find research labs in overcrowded cities whose mission is to study the most dangerous viruses and bacteria ever discovered. Engineers are perfectly aware that what they do could provoke catastrophes since they install everywhere expansion joints, emergency brakes, air purifiers, or grounding systems. When they build a dam system on a river, they produce as much energy and profits as possible by creating a series of artificial lakes that go from the base of a dam to the crest of the next one. But they never forget to add flood spillways on those dams because they know that something unforeseen could happen. To be fair, it's important to note that some human interventions are good for the environment. For instance, an hydroelectric dam built in the far north creates a microclimate that helps the local fauna and flora. Natives say that hunting is more productive near such a dam. Something similar happens when we create an artificial oasis in a desert or an artificial reef on a flat seabed, the reason being that many animal species can hide inside the sunken ship and proliferate despite the presence of their most dangerous predators. Since our natural environment are in a fast decline all over the world, we could think that the crisis I'm talking about will be triggered by some natural catastrophe. But it is unlikely because man-made disasters are much more common, wars being the best examples. In a way, a war, especially when a country attacks, is a natural phenomenon since it normally starts when a country has accumulated enough resources and has enough young men to sacrifice. This being said, wars and battles are normally launched by an individual. It happened on the 6th of June 1944 when Dwight Eisenhower stopped talking for some minutes to weigh all the arguments in favor or against an immediate invasion of Normandy. After a while, Eisenhower just said, "Let's go," two words that released on the European coast all the energy accumulated by tens of millions of workers during 3 years. Once that order had been given, nobody and nothing could have stopped the brutal avalanche that followed, not even Eisenhower. Something striking is that almost nobody during the 1940s talked about the environmental damages that the Second World War would cause. Such an attitude would be unthinkable nowadays, since everybody knows that an all-out war would destroy the planet. Our modern weapons are so powerful that the real crisis, the one that will really hurt, will probably be the result of an accumulation of small regional wars whose combined effects will kill many more people than the wars themselves. One of those effects will be the destruction of many essential communication links that even our modern governments cannot repair for lack of money. In the Western world, the decadence is the main reason why our governments are penniless. Since Europe has not been devastated by a major war or a major crisis for at least 2 generations, a large proportion of its population is made of spoiled babies who have been raised with a silver spoon in their mouth and who just don't understand how difficult it is to earn and save money. For them, when there is no more money or chocolate, they simply have to ask for more from daddy, from mommy, from the governments, from the rich, from the multinationals, etc. Those eternal children just don't understand that if borders exist all over the living kingdom, even around bacteria, it is to protect wealth. The false refugee crisis in Europe is a pure product of that mentality, since it is the spoiled kids of the most naturally protected European countries that do everything they can to flood their homelands with millions of undocumented and potentially dangerous migrants. Sweden, which was once considered a model society, is the best example of that, since migrants who come from sub-Saharan Africa can only reach it by crossing many African nations, the Sahara Desert, the inhabited part of North Africa, the Mediterranean Sea, many European countries, and finally the Baltic Sea. Of course, when you brutally disrupt the fine-tuned and profitable economic machine built during centuries by an homogeneous nation like the one that was living in Sweden, that nation stops producing surpluses and soon become unable to help the third world. Since decadence is a cultural disease that corrupts all nations, the leaders of such nations stop doing what their ancestors have been doing for centuries. When there is an election, they try to outcompete their adversaries by promising to the population new tax breaks and new free services. How do they pay for that? Very simple. They simply stop repairing the country's infrastructure, and they lower the interest rate to almost zero, which allows them to print money like crazy and to create gigantic national debts that are almost interest-free. Of course, all that money printing increases the quantity of money available on the market without increasing the quantity of goods produced. As a result, prices keep going up until the salaries and the pensions paid to the population have lost most of their purchasing power. Since the economic and the political situation keeps deteriorating in the Western world, in countries like Brazil or Venezuela, and especially in the Middle East and in Central Africa, it is highly probable that the poverty, the suffering, and the anxiety created by the next economic depression will provoke regional and Syrian-like civil wars in many parts of the world. Considering the ever-increasing power and toxicity of our modern weapons, those conflicts will poison a lot of agricultural land and force millions of farmers to flee. The famines that will create will weaken so much the immune system of all nations that their populations will soon be decimated by epidemics. Such a catastrophe seems inevitable since the UN reported in 2013 that mankind as a whole had food reserves for less than 3 months. As usual, you can verify what I say with the bibliography I normally put at the end of my videos. Since the invention of penicillins in 1928, people forgot that our global population has been controlled for millions of years by those 3 inseparable and closely related serial killers we call wars, famines, and epidemics. Throughout history, epidemics have been by far the most efficient killers of that sinister triad. Pandemics, much more than genocides, have been responsible for the population collapse of the natives after the discovery of the Americas. The 1348 plague epidemics in Europe killed at least 1/3 of the population. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemics killed more people than the whole First World War, etc. Very few people know that many viruses, including the AIDS and the Ebola viruses, are found not only in humans, but in many wild animal species. If it is like that, it is because some humans have been living in tropical forests for millions of years and have been infected by those viruses and bacteria through animal bites, insect bites, or because they ate bushmeat. And those people spread those diseases all over the world because by using the road network that we built all over the world. Of course, today we are well protected by vaccines and antibiotics, but we must always remember that those two inventions have a very fundamental flaw. They favor the survival and the reproduction of two things: weak humans and very strong diseases. That doesn't bode well for the future of mankind, because since the invention of the penicillin, humans have stopped evolving and developed their immune system through natural selection, while bacteria kept evolving so fast that today many of them resist to all the known antibiotics. You can easily imagine the slaughter created in the poorest country of the world when the developed countries will no longer have enough money to pay to find new vaccines and new drugs. In the past, when a war, a famine, or an epidemics were ravaging a country, many people living in cities tried to save their lives by moving to the countryside, where very often they met the barricades built in some strategic locations by farmers and by locals who wanted to protect their crops, their belongings, and their families. If in the following years the anarchy proved to be permanent, it was the case at the end of the Roman Empire, those barricades became permanent borders separating many small autonomous regions. We call it geopolitical regression. When civilization regresses like that, the international roads stopped being used and fall into disrepair, which means that the most isolated regions of the world can no longer be helped if they are devastated by some catastrophe. In the last video, I talked about the gigantic tsunami that would kill millions and millions of Egyptians if the Aswan Dam, located in Upper Egypt, was to rupture. The death toll would be much higher if at the same moment the rest of the world was paralyzed by a major crisis and had become too poor to finance the rescue of the millions of people who would live among the debris of the tsunami and among the decomposing corpses. The famine and the epidemics that would follow would probably kill most of the survivors. Biologists have shown that such demographic collapses are common in nature, especially when a species has overexploited its natural habitat. Since humans are not gods or angels but just another animal species, and since we do behave like animals by doing next to nothing to save the natural environments that keep us alive, we will be forced to pass through the very narrow demographic bottleneck that is in front of us. In other words, our global population will keep declining until passing under the threshold where nature will be able to recover without any help. When epidemics will have killed enough people all over the world, the situation will stabilize and all the man-made deserts will slowly come back to life. Our descendants who will start rebuilding the world will probably feel like the first rescuers who invaded the ruins of the World Trade Center after the terrorist attack of September 2001. Manhattan, which had been evacuated, was totally silent with the only exception being the extremely annoying sound coming from the rubbles of the Twin Towers, a sound so loud that it was sometimes impossible to hear the screams of the survivors who were trapped under tons of concrete. Despite that nerve-wracking sound, about 20 survivors were rescued during the following hours. The firemen who kept throwing water over the fuming debris of the Twin Towers, and the investigators who were looking for clues about the terrorists all complained about that harrowing sound. What was that sound? It was the sound of the thousands of cell phones who kept ringing all over the ruins for days. The families of the victims kept calling in vain. If you enjoyed the present video, please share it with your friends and family. See you next time.